All right, looking tonight at Ezekiel 17. Ezekiel 17, I hope after chapter 16 comes as a breath of fresh air because 16 is a little dense. It reminded me of something. You have to forgive me for when I was raised and the movies I watched, but this was the thought that came to my mind. Anybody ever seen Monsters, Inc.? Monsters, Inc., 2319, right? You know what 2319 means? I just discovered this like a week ago. It means white sock. 23 is W, 19 is S. WS, white sock. There's a white sock on the guy. So anyway, if you've never seen this, right? Of course, he comes back from being in the door, and the guy in the green yells, 2319, and then they do like an emergency shaving, right, to get rid of all the contaminants, okay? This was the face that I thought of when I go, okay, this is what the Bible student looks like after reading Ezekiel 16. It's one of those, I never knew that was there, type of thing. However, it's sort of my task, hopefully, to draw you back into the action, Lord willing. Ezekiel 17 does that. It's a nice, calm parable, nice, easy parable. We can sort of get through that. Okay, what do we find in the first 10 verses? All right, chapter 17, first 10 verses. This follows, if you're in your lesson book, the first part of the observation. When we read a text, we read it through the first time, and then the second time through sort of think about what do you see in each section, right, like a summary. What do you find generally in the first 10 verses here? Chapter 17. The sound of vigorously Googling Ezekiel 17, right? Not really. What do you see in the first 10 verses? You don't have to tell me the entire story, but what is it that's there? It's a parable, right? Because if you see verse 1, what does he say? Or sorry, rather, verse 2. I'm sorry, that's Ezekiel 18. I was reading that earlier today. That's next week. He says, the word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, propound a riddle and speak a parable to the people of Israel. Right? And so that's basically what you get in the first 10 verses. It's a parable about who are the main characters. You don't have to tell me who they represent, but in the parable, what are the main characters here?
An eagle.
One eagle at least.
Or two eagles.
Two eagles, right?
And a big tree.
Big cedar, big tall tree. One more.
Vine.
And a vine. Okay? And there's some, what the eagle cares for the vine, and there's sort of some things going along with that. Verses, that's basically what it is. God tells Ezekiel, tell a story or tell a parable to the people of Israel. Parables, earthly story with heavenly meaning. There is a story that's going to provide some meaning to them. That's what you find in the first 10 verses. Verses 11 and following are when God does what? 11, say to 21.
Interprets.
Yeah, here's what it means. All right, 11 to 21, God says specifically, here's what I'm talking about. The parable is describing the relationship between Zedekiah. Now, remind us, who is Zedekiah? Someone else.
He was the king set up after, it's not Jeconiah, I'm trying to think of the one prior was taken off to Babylon, and then he's set up by Babylon to rule, and then he rebels against, ultimately he will rebel against Babylon too.
Right. So he's kind of the final official king of Israel, right? Or of Judah, we should say.
If I remember correctly, Nebuchadnezzar made him make an oath before God.
Yes.
And so it's not just against Nebuchadnezzar. He's made an oath before God, and he hasn't kept that.
Right. And we're told more of what happens in the story in Jeremiah. Jeremiah fills in a lot of the historical details that help us with this. But in essence, Zedekiah made a promise before God and to be faithful to Nebuchadnezzar as a vassal servant king. All right. What did he do, someone other than Mark and Julian, what did he do to break, I'm not picking on you, I do this in high school too. What did he do specifically that was treacherous, untrustworthy, betrayal? What did he do? While he was the servant king of Nebuchadnezzar or Babylon, that means you have to kind of pay allegiance to him. He turned to the Egyptians and be like, hey, please get me out of this, right? Please help me with this Babylon thing. one turning from the nation he should have served to the nation he shouldn't have served. God reminds him, or God tells him, the product of this. What would happen when Babylon attacks? Remember, this is written in the future, but what would be the result when Babylon attacks Jerusalem? What would Egypt do? Okay, I saw one guy shaking his head. That's exactly right. Nothing, right? They would not help. They would not get in the way when Babylon comes through to destroy Jerusalem for the final time, right? Now, the last three verses are to me very interesting, because the parable is relative to the Israelites, relative to the nation of Judah and Jerusalem. And God explains the parable, but then he goes back into parable terms and he tells another one. What's the second one about? Yeah, if you want to.
It's about the future, what's yet to come, that God is going to create, if you will, he'll create anew what used to be, but in a different, if you will, it's different. It will be like it was. It'll be a mighty tree, but now God will set the tree, whereas God first took down a tree, and now he'll replace it with one of his choosing.
He's going to take a sprig from what appears to be the same tree and then plant it on the high and lofty mountain. Someone other than Mark, where is that? What's he talking about? High and lofty mountain God's really concerned with most of the time? Jerusalem, Zion, right? That's the mountain in question. Yes?
Well, really, I mean, this tender one that's mentioned in verse 22, that's really talking about Christ, because if you read Isaiah 53:2, that's how he's described as the tender root and dry ground. This is what God's going to do. He's going to bring a new leader, and it's not going to be just for Israel. It's going to, all the birds are going to be there. It's going to be for all nations. And so to me, that's pointing toward Christ. And then that, and then the fulfillment, in essence, then of the promise to Abraham, where all will be one nation.
We left out one character from the parable earlier, and that's my mistake. In verse 4 of chapter 17, who is the cedar that's taken away from the top in verse 3 and plucked off and carried to the land of merchants? Who's that? Someone else. Not Zedekiah. Because Zedekiah is the replacement vine, right? Who do you think of when you think of the very top of the tree of Israel? Who would that represent? Be the king. It'd be the previous king, Jehoiachin. The same one carried away captive when Ezekiel left. Okay. Now, why do I mention that? Because that the twig from Jehoiakim, or the twig that is Jehoiakim, the top twig, I think I call him later in the thing, he's taken away and he's replaced. And verse 22, he's going to take a twig from the lofty top of the cedar, the same tree. Jesus is a descendant of David, just like Jehoiachin. He's in he's in the same family, which matters, right? A lot for what happens in the future. There's a really cool line in this, verse 23, the birds of every kind will nest under it. They will nest in the shade of its branches. That is something Jesus actually says almost verbatim in one of his parables. We'll talk about that, Lord willing, in a second. Okay, other than what exactly is there, what did you notice? What stood out to you? Anything repeated? Anything interesting, weird, personally neat to you? Right? What did you see in chapter 17? This is one of those chapters that's probably real clean. Right? This isn't Acts 2. Right? This is a chapter we don't talk about much. What did you see?
I was going to make a point. I think that it's interesting to me that God doesn't set up that last chapter. He doesn't set up the new tree until he is taking care of the old tree, if you will. And it looks to me like, if you think of it this way, God is telling Israel why he is justified in removing the one tree and replacing it with a new growth. So that the old tree, it was carried off, if you will, it was destroyed. And so he has planted a new one, and he's justified in doing so. You know, that part of this chapter is setting up, that this parable sets up why he can do that.
The tree never dies. In all of this. It's the same tree, right? He never destroys the tree entirely. Israel never dies in that sense. The line never dies. The top of it's taken off, Jehoiachin taken off to Babylon. It's replaced by this vine who was unfaithful to his caretaker. And then God says a little later in the parable, at the end of the parable, I'm going to take another one, and I'm going to set it in Zion, and I'm going to make it grow, and everyone's going to flock to it, and it's going to shelter everyone. That's a big deal, right? But the tree never dies. It's a good reference to God's faithfulness to Israel.
In the parable, in effect, in the chapter, he sets two lines. One is going to be plucked out, right? And that's Zedekiah. He begins to grow, and then, if you will, he's plucked out by because they tried to take refuge in Egypt. They'll be destroyed and scattered and so on, and then the second planting from the top of the tree will grow into another mighty cedar. So I think from following the account, there were two settings of vines. One will be plucked away, the other will grow into a great tree.
What else did you guys notice? Did you see in chapter 17? A couple new faces, so that's good. One more. Make it.
It's hard to wrap your mind around this because it's almost like Ezekiel speaking directly to Israel. And I have to remember, no, he's telling this to the captives who are with him about Israel. And so that's the other layer on this that adds a little complication to it, if you will, to understand it, because he's telling them what's going to happen in Jerusalem, and that God is playing, if you will, God is pulling the strings on this. Whatever happens over there, this is not by accident. God is exactly, if you will, he's exacting vengeance on Israel and is justified in doing it.
The message is still to the exiles. Now, Zedekiah is not left out of the loop here. Right? Jeremiah tells him personally this almost the same information, right? You've done this, and God's going to destroy you for that reason. Why would someone other than Mr. Mark, because I want more talkers, why would the exiles need to hear this? If it's for them and it's to them, and why would they need to hear this story about how God's going to destroy Zedekiah?
They're Jewish. This is their history, regardless of where they're at.
Okay. So just important to them because they're Jewish? All right. Yes.
In their minds, fixing things means getting them back home. God's saying fixing things is growing my remnant and getting them stable, and I will bring them back home.
Yes. He's establishing here's the plan, and the plan isn't Zedekiah, nor is it Jehoiachin or anybody else. The plan is this new person from Israel, this new sprout, you might say, that I'm going to bring back, and I'm going to plant, and then he will flourish. It's a big expectation type thing, right? One more.
Just a question, do we know, is this foretelling what will happen? Is this telling them what already happened? Do we know the timeline?
Foretelling.
It's foretelling.
Yes.
Okay, so Zedekiah hasn't happened yet.
Yes.
Ezekiel writes it.
Because I think, because at the very least, you look at that in verse 17, Pharaoh with his mighty army and great company will not help him in the war, right? He despised the oath, which means it has happened, and Zedekiah has already done that. And then he says he pledged his allegiance, that's already happened. Yet all these things he shall not escape. So we're in that between when Zedekiah did it and when it comes to pass, right, timeline-wise. Anything else you want to spot? Yes.
And this is kind of a little point, but I thought it was interesting in verse 21, because in the New Testament we talk about the Jewish diaspora. It says the survivors will scatter to every wind, reminding me of the passage where it says in every city there are synagogues where Moses is probably quoting it wrong.
No, but the idea is right.
Yeah.
Right? The Jews really would just, they would be scattered all over the place. And then they would have to be drawn back from the four winds, right? Same idea. A couple of times there is a parallel that's made in the chapter. Verse 2, the parable is written to the house of Israel. Verse 11, when God says, "Say now to the rebellious house." And we've known this. We've studied Ezekiel for a few weeks now, but it's interesting that in the first part it says house of Israel. They are the rebellious house. That's not a surprise, right? God calls them as much many times early in the book. At least in the ESV version of this, there's that kind of repeated question, will it thrive or will he thrive? Like, will this survive? God keeps posing that question again and again. It sort of serves as a framework for the chapter. In Bloch's commentary on the book, he noted that there is a duality, there's a series of twos that run throughout the chapter. Some of them are good, some of them are a little loose, but I thought at least worthy of mention because it is an organizational type thing. There are two eagles, there are two plants, there are two modes of judgment, there are two messages, doom for one and hope for the next. So there is that kind of idea. When you think of Zedekiah's main sin here is that he broke covenant with God. That sounds a whole lot like the audience, doesn't it? Now, Zedekiah broke covenant with God in the larger sense that he was probably idolatrous and unfaithful and that kind of thing. But Zedekiah is a case study of Israel as a whole. Israel broke covenant with God. And so God, who keeps covenant, judges them. Zedekiah is a very small version of that. Zedekiah broke my covenant with him that I had, the personal one, and so I'm judging him personally. Right? It's a small version of what's going on with Israel. Verse 9, there's this detail here at the end that I thought was kind of sad. The vine that's planted and then it begins spreading and reaching itself out, even uprooting itself, trying to get to this other eagle so the second one could take care of it. When God describes it being pulled up by the roots, he makes this side comment almost. It says, it will not take a strong arm or many people to pull it from its roots. I think that's the ESV version of it, if I remember right. It's just, I don't know why that struck me so much, but just not only is he going to be defeated, but it's not going to take much. It's just going to be like, it's not the big tall weed in your garden, it's the little one that you just kind of, you get rid of it.
If you have vining plants in a garden, have you ever tried to pull them up? They're hard to pull up once they set roots, a whole runner of roots. It's hard to pull them up. But when they get diseased and they're beginning to die off, well, it's pretty easy just to pull them out, And that's the comparison he's making.
It's not going to take much to wipe him out when it does happen, right? Being the big overall point there. But I don't know, that line just struck me. Completely fun fact, probably means nothing theologically, but at least in Hebrew, verse 9 has all the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. It doesn't happen all that often, but it does happen some. There's that sentence in English, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, right? So all the English letters are in the one sentence. Ezekiel 17:9 has actually all the Hebrew characters. Doesn't mean anything significant. It's just cool to look at. But again, Zedekiah's treachery against Nebuchadnezzar was, remember, treachery against God because God sort of set that up, and it was between those two. If we didn't have the explanation, how on earth would you discover what this meant? Two eagles and a vine, and one gets pulled out, and we have no idea what it means, right? Yes?
To that point, I find it interesting that the first parable is explained, and the second one is not. I mean, when I was filling in for you with the Romans class in the high schoolers, one of the questions, what's the mystery, right? Which, it's throughout Acts and Romans and a lot of the letters there. And I think it's good for the context here to understand when we see those kinds of phrases, that Paul or whatever New Testament writer is talking about this mystery that's now been made known, that it's this parable is the mystery, is that
Part of it, yeah.
did not understand what this parable meant, right? They understood the first part because it was explained, but the second part where now everyone's gathering under the boughs of the second tree that is grown from the original, it doesn't make sense at the time.
There's stuff you can draw from it. Like, this obviously is a very good situation. It's a very hopeful situation, but how exactly does it all work? He's exactly right. It's the mystery. It's part of it.
There's part you could draw from the picture that he took it from the tree. What was the mighty tree? Well, you understand that.
Yeah.
Because he's explained the rest of the parable, you could figure out, well, that's telling me it's coming from Israel. God's going to pluck from Israel something that is going to be planted.
They're looking for something, but they don't know everything about it, right? That part has to be revealed.
Show how they got so confused about the concept of this was a worldly monarchy that was going to be reestablished, because all of the context in the first parable is of their worldly monarchy that is being destroyed, and then the second part of the parable is, okay, well, restore it with the same comparisons, I mean, with the tree and everything there. And so it seems logical that, they weren't just stupid and didn't
No.
understand what was happening. They really didn't get it because it was impossible to get at
By
the
design,
time.
by design,
Yeah.
right? Jesus' own parables were this way too. Who got to hear the explanations of the parables of Jesus? The apostles and whomever else showed up and asked and listened. Right? Jesus would tell the parable, and then they'd come to Jesus, what does this mean? And he'd tell them, here's what it means. Right? So when God chooses to reveal or not to reveal, it's his business, and he knows why he did it. Right? And sometimes he tells us, and that kind of thing. But this is pretty clear, I think, why, because it sets up the Messiah. But he wants to be understood. The time wasn't right. Right? What happens if he explains the Messiah to them all in detail here? Well, then it doesn't work later, right? There has to be something that's revealed later on in reference to Jesus. That's a good point about the mystery. I like that. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just kind of following from over there, talking about Messianic prophecies. And I went over to Daniel. Following that, 244 says, in the days these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people.
Right. Yeah, there is a day coming when God's going to set up this kingdom. And we see in Ezekiel 17 the leader and where the leader comes from. More importantly, the leader has to be a descendant of David. And that's matches, other places that you see. But you're absolutely right. It pointed forward to a time, and then Jesus would fulfill that.
To help explain what we're talking about there in Ezekiel chapter 17.
Those two definitely go together. All right. Now, what did it mean to them, right? Obviously, the last three verses are going to be verses filled with hope, filled with looking forward to the future, looking for this person that's going to come from the kingly line. They didn't have everything, right, fully explained and fleshed out. What would the listener have gathered, learned from this section, right? We want to hear it from their perspective first. What would an Israelite in Babylon have learned from, I almost said Ezra, Ezekiel 17? Right? What lessons should they have learned from this?
Things we've mentioned, their hope is not in Jerusalem, but also that, it affirms God's control over these events. This is not a godless event, it's a very, God-driven event.
So 2 lessons. One, Zedekiah is not the plan, right? If you're banking on him, he's out. But secondly, God is in control of all of this, right? He knows and understands what Babylon will do, what Egypt will do. All the pieces are in front of him, and he knows it. Right? God, it's like chess. God sees the entire board. He knows all the pieces. And he knows all the moves that are coming next. And he's explaining this to the exiles. Here's how the game's going to be played. Right? And he's in control of that, which is comforting, right, to an exile. All right, what else? Yes, sir.
Sort of the same thing. Yeah, you're not going to fix this. There's not a plan that you can put in place that will get you back home and make Israel important again.
So yeah, there's no way you could fix this. What would be the absolute worst way to try to fix this, according to what Zedekiah did? Don't reach out to foreign countries. When in Israel's history were they ever permitted to seek the aid of a foreign nation? Never, right? That's never supposed to happen. The closest analog you get to that is in the wilderness wanderings when they asked to pass through the land of other nations. Kind of like a friendly, don't touch us, we won't touch you, just let us use the road, right? That's as close as it gets. They were allowed to be friendly with other nations, at least not the Canaanite nations, right? They could trade with other peoples. But they were never supposed to reach out for help to other nations. Why?
They had God.
They have God. And God is enough. He's more than enough. But when you forget that and you fail to believe it, then you start looking around for help, right? God was good enough. Why did Zedekiah go to the Egyptians? Not that God wasn't good enough. Zedekiah lost his faith somewhere along the way. And he sought for a way out other than the way God prescribed for him. Sounds a lot like Abram and Sarah in Genesis 17. They sought a plan other than the one God had given them, right? And it didn't end well. Okay, other lessons. We've got a couple minutes. This is a short chapter. Other things Israelites should have learned from this. Did I see a wave? Okay, thought you were pawning it off on Katie.
Yes, yeah. Katie answered. No, I don't know how useful this noticing is, but I mean, for them, I mean, the more broad, stop relying on other nations is definitely the lesson to pull, but I mean, specifically, why do you keep going back to Egypt? I mean, this is what, the 17th time that you're cycling back specifically to them?
Yeah.
I mean, when I'm reading that sentence of God through Ezekiel explaining, I mean, in verse 15, I hear him just completely exasperated. Like, Egypt, again? Really?
Yeah. And you remember from 16, Egypt wasn't the only nation they reached out to in their history, right? So this is sort of narrowing in on the things that Zedekiah did. But you're exactly right. Why them, right? They were literally the problem I saved you from. And you're going to go try to solve your problem by going back and having them saved. That can't work, you know. But when you abandon God, you become desperate. You know, a famous comedian says you reach a point where you're willing to give the ridiculous a try. And this is about as bad as it gets. It makes sense if you don't put God in the equation, because Egypt's a powerful nation. Maybe they can help with Babylon. Carchemish would say otherwise, but.
And when you just said that, I thought from basically this time forward, it appeared that Israel would do anything to be important again. Even by the time we get to Jesus, they missed David so bad that they would put up with anything if they thought the nation of Israel would matter again.
Even going so far as to train some of their soldiers as revolutionaries and like guerrilla terrorists and guerrilla fighters and that kind of thing. Okay. So main characters, just in case we were unclear, right, on the way through. Right, we want to make sure we get who is everybody. The first eagle is Nebuchadnezzar. One author did note that when you compare the two, at least in the chapter, Nebuchadnezzar is described a little bit more elaborately than the second eagle is. I don't know how much stock to put in that, but it is interesting. The first eagle is Nebuchadnezzar. He is the one who hauled off Jehoiachin to Babylon, right? That is the top twig of the cedar there. Now notice verse 5. He also took some of the seed of the land. That's an important line. It's in reference to someone that was in the line of Jehoiachin, which Zedekiah was, right? They're related. So he takes of the seed of the land and plants it, and it becomes or he set it like a willow, it becomes a vine, and so forth. The second eagle's Pharaoh, and then the sprig that becomes the great cedar is the Messiah. Right? He is the one that would sit on David's throne. Remember, David was promised in 2 Samuel 7, you'll have one to sit on your throne forever. Right? So whoever this next person is, to them, we know who it is. But whoever it was to them would have to restore David's throne. Back to chapter 16. It should sound familiar that Ezekiel tells a story about a vine that had it real well and then decided he wanted to pursue other things and then got a lot worse as a result of it. That's the woman of chapter 16, whom God lavished on her everything she could possibly want. And then she took those things and used them to pursue any and everything else. Right? It's another version of that same betrayal kind of dynamic, right? Zedekiah's story as a singular is the woman of chapter 16, what she did. It's a small version of that. Babylon's going to destroy Zedekiah is really one of the big ones we should get right off the bat. What's interesting, if you go back and you look at the accounts that's listed in Jeremiah, this one, Jeremiah 27, God was willing to spare Zedekiah's life if he would submit to Nebuchadnezzar. It's not one of those, hey, listen, I need you to submit to Nebuchadnezzar, and he's going to come and destroy you and kill you anyway. That's not the plan at all. The original agreement was, you submit to Nebuchadnezzar, I'll protect you. You'll be fine. It will be okay, just don't mess this up. And he chose not to.
I just had a question. You were talking about how this sounds familiar from chapter 16. Am I correct in understanding that these are different points in time? That, I mean, 16, the whole thing happening there, there's then, I mean, we don't know how long, but some amount
Yes.
of time
Yes.
between 16 and then
Yes.
17.
16 is describing Israel as a whole, right? And 17 is describing this thing that's going to happen with Zedekiah. Now, they're both going to come about at the same time, right? Zedekiah is going to be destroyed when the city's destroyed, so they kind of happen together. But they are describing separate things. Does that make sense? Separate judgments.
I'm sorry, I meant like when Ezekiel is recounting this information.
Oh, yeah,
are two
definitely
separate
two different times.
occasions.
Definitely, yeah, they're definitely separated. So all of 16 is a different thing than 17. Our Bibles put them, next to each other, but they would have been separate.
A good way to know that, the first line of 16, 17, and 18, the word of the Lord came.
Yes.
Each time that happens,
Yes.
it's a new instance.
When that begins, almost always it's a new oracle, right, or a new thing happening. Usually the chapter breaks fall at pretty good places with that. And the only differences would be like in 17:11, it says, "Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me." So kind of, in addition to that, more stuff's going to come along. But you look at 18, the word of the Lord came to me, right? 19, there's a different shift in the type of language, so you can see that. But yeah, definitely separate. The final 3 verses, big ray of hope in a book that's really hard to hear as a whole, and a story that's really hard to hear just in chapter 17. Right? The whole thing is grim, and then you get this ray of sunshine there at the end of the chapter. Things are going to be better. Right? I am going to bless you again. Big takeaway, I think, for Israel, if you forsake God, you are not going to survive. Now, in this example, Zedekiah forsook Nebuchadnezzar and was destroyed because of it. But the bigger lesson is what happens to Israel when they abandon God. You remember in Psalm 1, how is the person described in Psalm 1? He is like a tree planted by rivers of water, right? The opposite of that, at the end of the chapter, he's like a what? Like chaff that the wind drives away, right? Something very alive versus something very dead. The person that's dependent on God and trusts God to provide for them, they're going to flourish and be abundant. The alternative is what happens to the vine here. It withers and it's pulled up and it's thrown away.
We were talking Sunday about what seems right in our own mind. We talked about Saul and that type of stuff. If you were an Israelite at this time, Nebuchadnezzar's the bad guy. Zedekiah is just trying to get Israel back and make them matter again. And wouldn't that be what God would want it? And I mean, surely God wants us to be back in Israel again. And if when we use our own judgment, we can, what's the right word? Justify it because it makes sense to us.
That was
Kind of parallel to Habakkuk's problem, right? Habakkuk's like, what are you going to do about all the wicked in the land? God says, I'm bringing the Babylonians. And Habakkuk's like, wait, they're worse than we are. Why would you do that? God's the one in control of all of these things, right? If God tells Zedekiah, I need you to be submissive to Nebuchadnezzar, and if you do that, you'll be fine. He could have just done that and been fine. Jeremiah, right, tells that story. He didn't. He didn't trust that submission to the king was the right idea, right? What did all the exiles have to do when they got to Nebuchadnezzar? They didn't immediately form a sub-nation of Israel and start fighting the Babylonians. They had to submit, right? Daniel and, the 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Anyway, let's bring it home, right, to us. First of all, any application, I think, of the Old Testament has to start with Jesus. We've talked about this one specifically, but I wanted you to see it sort of in the New Testament. The top twig of the cedar being Israel, the top twig was Jehoiachin, also known as Jeconiah. So when you said Jeconiah earlier, you're not wrong, right? Jeconiah is another alternate way of saying, of giving his name. Jesus would have to be a descendant of Jeconiah to qualify as one able to sit on David's throne. The text below that is Matthew 1:11 through 16, where it lists Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. Now, Matthew's genealogy does not include every single name. His is selectively chosen, I think, to form a pattern. But the beginning and the end are really the parts that matter, right? Jeconiah became the father of Shealtiel, and him the father of Zerubbabel, and so on, until you get down to Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born. It doesn't say Joseph's his father, it says he was the husband of Mary. In Luke's version of this, in Luke chapter 3, the same sort of progression is made, but it's in reverse. Luke starts with Jesus and works backwards, right? Matthew starts with Abraham and works forwards. But in Luke's version, Luke 23:23, Jesus worked all the way back, and then there's your two names. The son of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, right? Shealtiel is Jeconiah's kid. That means Jesus is a descendant of the kingly line. He qualifies to sit on the throne, right? So this whole, at the end of chapter 17, God takes a twig from that same tree and he plants it in Zion and it becomes a mighty tree and the birds shelter under it. That's Jesus, and it works because he's of that line, right? He qualifies to sit on David's throne. When you start looking more specifically, of course, we talked about this too, Jesus told a lot of parables. I love this line. Look at Ezekiel 17. God says this, I love this. Ezekiel 17:12, say now to the rebellious house, do you not know what these things mean? Right? Do you not know what these things mean? Jesus says specifically in the Gospels, do you know what these things mean? I love that. God says it in Ezekiel 17. Jesus shows up, tells a parable, and then he says, do you know what these things mean? I mean, the whole the red light flashing like, hey, hold on, I've seen this before. That should be really obvious to someone that knows their Old Testament. That a guy just told a parable and then immediately said, do you know what this means? And then he gives you the meaning, right? Big flashing red light saying, hey, you should notice this. This sounds a whole lot like what God used to do back in the Old Testament. Now, the line I mentioned to you about the birds of every kind sheltering underneath, Jesus uses that image in the parable of the mustard seed. Okay, parable of the mustard seed, Matthew 13:31. He presented another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, and this is smaller than all the other seeds. When it's full grown, it's larger than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. He uses the same imagery as Ezekiel 17 to describe not himself in this case, but the kingdom. Right? But it's the same idea. Jesus is king of this kingdom. And in this kingdom, people would be able to come from all over and take shelter. Now, the birds of the air coming from every direction and nesting in the branches, what is that in reference to? Something would be true about the kingdom that wasn't true for Israel. Yeah, not everybody could be an Israelite. Only descendants of Abraham. Everybody could come into the kingdom of God. Right? It would be open to everyone. And people would come from the four winds, Jews and Gentiles alike, and they would take shelter. It points to the Gentile inclusion in the kingdom. Of course, Paul hammers on this in Romans and in Galatians and in other places. Applications for us, stuff we should learn. Number one, it's okay to tell a story to get a point across, so long as you explain it. Right? Don't just tell a mysterious story and go, now you guys figure it out. Right? You're going to tell a story, you got to tell what exactly is being talked about. Even Nathan the prophet comes to David on one instance. You remember, how does he convince David that he's done something wrong? He tells him a story about an old man and his wee lamb, and then the lamb's taken, right? And David says, yeah, punish him. And Nathan goes, you're the man. It's okay with one another to tell a story that gets a point across, but we got to make sure we explain it well, right? sadly, a lot of the Christian world, Christian in the largest sense, the denominational world, they're good on the story part, but the meaning part is the rub, right? It doesn't exactly follow all the time. Simple put, if we leave our good soil by abundant waters, there's going to be no one to save us from ourselves when that happens. If we abandon God in whatever context you want to call it, pick one. You abandon God in any context, you are left to yourself, and left to yourself, you will not survive. Right? And that applies, that preaches everywhere, right? That's all over our Christian lives. We're called to shelter ourselves in God's kingdom and under the rule of his king, right? And that's, Jesus tells that account, Matthew 25. Why did I put that there? Oh, okay, that was in reference to Zedekiah broke covenant, and so he was judged by the one that keeps covenant. The same thing's true for us, right? If we enter into covenant with God by way of becoming a Christian, we're going to be judged by the one who keeps covenant if we break it, all right? Connection time. Isaiah 56, verses 3 through 8. Reason why I bring this up, Isaiah 56 would have been before Jeremiah's time, or rather Ezekiel's time. There's that line, look at the end of 17. God says this, 17:24, all the trees of the field will know that I am the Lord. I bring down the high tree, exalt the low tree, dry up the green tree, and make the dry tree flourish. I am the Lord, I have spoken, and I will perform it. The idea is, as Corey mentioned a moment ago, God is ultimately in control of everything that's going on. And he has the right to bring down and to lift up. He has the right to revive and to destroy according to his will. We're going to talk more about that in chapter 18 of Ezekiel. But in Isaiah 56, God makes a significant promise to foreigners, to Gentiles. And it's interesting, he says, let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. Gentiles had every right to expect that to happen. They're not Jewish. Nor let the eunuch say, behold, I'm a dry tree. Right? There's no hope for me. There's no future for me. Just like a eunuch has no hope of fathering children, there's no future hope for my generation. God says, for thus says the Lord to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath and choose what pleases me and hold fast my covenant, to them I will give in my house and within my walls a memorial and a name better than that of sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name which will not be cut off. God promises to the interesting line, the Gentiles who keep my covenant. Paul in Romans chapter 2 would reference those who are Jews who practice the law even though they're not Jews. Right? A Jew is one inwardly. It's not a sign of the law, or it's not a matter of the law. Anyway, just a really neat connection. Okay, we got this one out of the way. We got the point of the parable. We got God retold the parable, but with a different meaning. In the second parable, who or what is the cedar? We talked about who's the twig that gets planted, but who's the cedar in the parable? Both of them.
I think the tree in both examples was a kingdom. Israel.
The kingdom, right? The physical kingdom of Israel, right? That's why Jeconiah is the top twig. That's why God takes from that same tree and plants it on Zion and it flourishes. How does the parable help the exiles understand God's decision to destroy Jerusalem? Remember we said it's a small version of a bigger thing, right? How does this help the exiles understand why he's destroying Jerusalem? Their sin is the same as Zedekiah's. What was it? They broke covenant and they rebelled. Right? Zedekiah did it in his context, God's destroying him. Jerusalem did it, God's destroying them too. Right? Small version of the big story. We talked about this too. I'm out of time. Repeatedly, God says that he's acting so that they would know that I am the Lord. Why does God keep saying that to Israel? He says it like 20 dozen times in Ezekiel. Why does he keep telling them, I'm doing this so you'll know that I'm the Lord? Why keep hammering that nail? They've forgotten, or at least acting that way. Reaching out to Egypt for help as if God's not the one in charge.
And they're saying, why do we serve him and we don't get any benefit?
Why turn to other nations? Why turn to other gods? Right? God's doing all this to hammer into their mind once and for all, you're going to know that I am the Lord and there's no one else, right? All right, next week, chapter 18. I can't believe we actually made it, sort of. The soul that sins shall die. Probably one of the more familiar lines out of Ezekiel. We're going to look at that chapter as a whole, Lord willing, next week. All right, thank you guys for your comments tonight.